Hello, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to the Oxford Smart Space series. This is a set of activities, a set of panels hosted at Oxford University, grappling with some of the current debates and issues in the emerging and changing space sector. I'm Marc Ventresca on the faculty here at the Saïd Business School and Wolfson College, and we're joined today by a very distinguished panel who represent a wide range of positions and views in this emerging sector. The theme for today is really trying to understand key developments in what we're calling business process innovation, and really focused on infrastructures for new ventures. That's a set of topics that involve everything from how we fund ventures in the space sector, not only commercial initiatives, but also within the legacy agencies and other new intermediaries in the sector. It's also a question of what's exciting and important about those new forms of infrastructure. And again, I'm using that word in a very broad way, not only material or hardware or technology, but to understand the infrastructure that makes possible these novel, extraordinary efforts that characterize space today. This series in general is grappling with issues from technology and governance, what we at Oxford are calling smart space, that is recognizing the role of emerging technologies like artificial intelligence and other tools, but also the continued importance of the role of state actors, government funding, and new kinds of funding consortia, the enormous growth in commercially funded or venture capital funded initiatives, as well as a new generation of state space agencies across the world. Our panel today comes from a wide set of places. We are located in Japan, in Europe and the UK, and also in the US Bay Area in Silicon Valley. My panel today are three very distinguished colleagues who among them have worked with and helped build these agencies, these ventures. It's a very exciting group. The challenge we have in just this very brief 55 minutes is to open up these questions. What's happening in venture infrastructure? What's interesting? What's noteworthy? What's worrisome? I'm very grateful to all three colleagues who've joined us. The format that we'll do is I'll invite each to speak briefly about his or her professional background, their current location, and answer a tough question, which is, what are two developments, what are two key issues they see in the venture infrastructure space based on their own, again, institutional location, their own professional expertise. And I'm also going to ask them to comment at that point two kind of key developments in venture infrastructure, but also what's a trend that worries them? What's something they're noting with some concern or some sense of, are we going in the right direction? We'll have a chance to hear from each of them. I'm so delighted to have Hélène Huby join us from the Karman project, Nick Appleyard from ESA, and also Chris Blackerby from Astroscale. After that first round of questions, we'll have a chance for some back and forth, and then a second round of questions. That second round really is anchored on this issue. What are two key challenges they see facing the sector in this set of issues around venture infrastructure? What are two key challenges they see, and why do they think that? So in a sense, we have a chance to really probe the thinking and the interests and the insights of three very distinguished colleagues. At that point, we'll go over to you, our audience, and invite you to pose questions along the way. And we'll have, in those last 15 or 20 minutes, a chance to really hear your questions and your views. Again, I'm very grateful to the colleagues for joining us on the panel. I want to appreciate and recognize our sponsors at Oxford Saïd, at Pembroke College, and Aero-Ox, which is the student society at Oxford that is interested in aeronautics and all things having to do with space. I also want to recognize the many colleagues who've helped us bring together this series, our team at the Oxford Space Initiative, and also many of you who've joined us over these several sessions. And again, I want to encourage everyone to feel free to be posting questions and comments and observations in the chat. We have colleagues who are monitoring that and will help us respond to your interests and questions. Okay, at this point, I want to turn to the panel. Again, I'll start with Hélène, and then we'll go to Nick, and then Chris. I'd like you to each invite you each to say a minute or two about your own experience and your own perspective, and then we'll get right into that tough issue. What are the key developments you see in venture infrastructure today? And also, what's a worrisome trend? So Hélène, welcome, and over to you.
Hi, Mark. Thank you very much for inviting me. So a little bit about my background. So I'm currently here as the chairman of the Karman project, which is a foundation I co-created to foster trust and cooperation between the one who shapes the future of space. In parallel to that, I am working at Airbus as the Vice President R&D and SEM. So I'm in charge of the European Service Module, which is the European contribution to the R&D HICO. And in parallel to Airbus, also, I'm active in the investment side. I have a small investment boutique, double-digit million approximately, investing in space tech startups at seed and Series A stage. And I've contributed to funded, and I'm on the board of Space Founders, which is a German-French space tech accelerator. So my background is in basically investment, exploration, and also nonprofit to foster trust in space.
That's perfect. Thank you very much, Hélène. What do you see? You know, you have a very rich vantage point across sectors, in civil society, in the commercial space. What do you see? What are two key developments you see in this whole venture infrastructure space that you want to share with us? And what's a worrisome trend as well?
Yeah. So two key developments, and I guess many of our panelists members here will see the same, but one is, of course, the rise of venture funding into space. 10 years ago, we were speaking about probably like double-digit millions per year investing into space startups. And now we speak about several billions invested into space startups. And not only at early stage, of course, but I think what's something very important that happened in the past months, in the past years, is really exit, because this was one of the questions that investors were asking all the time: what is the exit? And we've seen now that's emergent acquisition happening, but also SPACs in recent months. For example, the SPAC of Astra, the SPAC of Momentus, the SPAC of Rocket Lab. And I'm aware also about new SPACs arriving on the market. So I think in 10 years, really the venture investment in space has become professional and also credible because of these exits. So that's one trend. The second one is, I think, the way space agencies fund their project. It's more and more based on, I would say, a public-private business model, where the space agency would fund the development, but in the development phase, they would put into competitions companies to make sure that at the end of the day, they really invest into the best company for the service they want to have. And also, they do not fund only development and buy, step by step, one mission. They basically buy a whole bunch of a service that has to be kind of, there is a kind of return investment behind that. So private has also to share part of the burden of the funding to make the service happen. And I think that's a second kind of big trend. Space agencies putting into competitions corporates and startups at the early phase of development, and then when the, let's say, the infrastructure is there, paying for a service much more than paying for a specific mission, which gives much more freedom, of course, to the industry to be more efficient.
Yeah, that's great. That's fascinating. And you've certainly seen across each of those sectors and each of those pieces, you have a foot in each of those worlds. So appreciate the breadth of your vision. What are you concerned about? What's a trend that you think is worrisome, or, we just need to pay more attention to?
Yeah, so I see two trends. One is perhaps a bit specific to Europe, I don't know, but we tend to oppose startups and corporates. And I see sometimes reaction like, okay, you're a big one, you don't need that contract, or you're unable to produce nanosatellites, etc. And same with the startup, you're a small one, so that's not your area of business, etc. And I think we need to go over that. I was very happy in Europe when the European Space Agency gave a contract to ClearSpace, 75, if I'm correct, contract for ClearSpace to do active debris removal. And I think, Chris, you were talking from Astroscale, and you had the same, kind of support from the Japanese Space Agency. And this is a huge mission, and this was given to a startup at a very early stage. So I think that's the first move towards that. Then speaking more from a corporate perspective, because I'm also working for Airbus, sometimes I think it's really, let's say, a shame that corporates are perceived like not able to do things which are nimble. And at Airbus doing OneWeb, I think we've proven that we are able to do nimble, agile stuff. So these trends opposing between corporate and startup is something that worries a bit me. And I think in the way agencies fund and also corporate behaves, we could go for much more cooperation that would benefit the whole ecosystem. The second trend I'm a bit worried about is very deep tech investment. I think there is a very important role here for space agencies to invest in very advanced technology. Speak about nuclear propulsion, for example. The US are starting to do that right now, with specifically on nuclear propulsion, more and more investment coming both from DARPA and from NASA. But I think in other areas of the world, would be good that more and more space agency really think about long term. What are the key tech we need? And then invest much more money into that and have a clear separation between what can be funded by the private sector and what shall be funded by the public money. And I think looking down to the past, we didn't have that distinction because there was no private funding for space, or very limited. But now that we have one, I think there is really a new important role for space agencies to fund heavily key tech technologies that will never be funded by private sector. And on the contrary, not funding stuff that can be funded by private sector.
Yep. Hélène, that's extremely interesting. Thank you. I think you're pointing to some opportunities that could be missed because of the legacy understandings we have both of what corporates do and what the public sector can do. I think this is a theme that my colleague and our colleague Lucas Kello has flagged. In fact, it's really part of the very name of this series, Smart Space, meaning the continued relevance of state agencies, of state space agencies, and also the emerging technologies, the deep tech that you're referring to. Thank you so much. It's extremely interesting, and you've set a high bar now for all of our panelists to come. So let me move on for a minute to Nick Appleyard, who's coming to us. Nick is at the European Space Agency and really oversees a lot of the downstream applications. Nick, over to you and welcome. Again, two key developments and a concern you might have.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Well, let's come at this from the point of view of what it is that the investment needs to go into, and then we can see what the response the investment community has to make to this. So if you start from the incumbency from 20 to 50 years ago, this was very much a government-led activity. Government was the customer because the price tag for entry was so high that was the only way that you could get into the game. You needed billions. And then the only people who could respond to that as suppliers were the big aerospace and defense contractors. So you had to be Boeing or Lockheed, or you had to be Airbus or Thales. Otherwise, you weren't big enough to supply to those kind of contracts. That is being challenged now from two directions. So the first is this idea that you can actually come in large with something which is completely disruptive, a new technology, a disruptive innovation approach, and you can sweep aside that incumbency and reset the rules of the game. So this is not unique to space, but it's been happening in space, as I think we're all aware in the past few years. But in order to do this, you have to take a big technology risk and a big market risk. And you need to be going in big enough in order to displace the incumbents, which means you're making a very big capital investment up front. So you have to it's go big or go home. Huh? And the kind of everybody wanted to be Steve Jobs when they wanted to do this kind of game. Then for a short while they wanted to be Travis Kalanick, and now they want to be Elon Musk.
Elon Musk.
So that's one challenge to the incumbency. And then there's a second challenge to the incumbency at the moment, which is quite opposite to that, which is about a diversification of the actors in the market. More people are able to enter the market because the price point has come down very considerably. So now you can build and launch a spacecraft with a company which is only capitalized to single-digit millions. So we're talking about seed capital and Series A capital, and so now we're developing a market, multiple suppliers, supplying to multiple customers, and that's a very different challenge to the incumbency. But it's happening at the same time, and this is where I come into this story. My own background is in the digital services, digital sector innovation. I was working in UK government in Innovate UK, leading the programs in that area. Looked at what was happening in the space industry, and you can see that same kind of disruption that was happening 10 years prior in the web services is starting to happen in the space industry now. Right, everybody is getting a more democratized access to the data, to the telecommunications capability, to the location signals, which are on all our phones. And you build a market in the digital services which make use of the satellites. And that is now starting to work its way in space parlance upstream. It's working its way back towards the infrastructure level. So I came in order to help develop that market, both from the demand side of the non-space customers who are users of the satellite data, and then to make sure that we have a market which is able to supply to those on the space side. And that market frontier is moving. It started with the system integrators and the data companies, Then it started to move into the satellite operators themselves and the satellite manufacturers, because the price point allows us to do that. Now it's getting into the rockets and the launch. It's going to get into the in-orbit servicing of the people who have spacecraft, who are then providing services to one another. And we'll come on to Chris in a moment. Maybe you can pick up on that thing. And it's so slowly moving further away from the planet's surface that actually there's a market dynamic, multiple suppliers talking to multiple customers. So those two things are happening both at the same time. In terms of something that worries me around all of this, from a European perspective, whichever one of those approaches you're taking, we have a bit of a gap in the European risk finance market. And this is not unique to space and is not new, but when you're trying to raise 20 to 50 million for a venture, we're still not well served in Europe. Up to 20 million, we're very well served. There's great seed capital, great Series A venture provision, particularly in London, but all across Europe. But beyond that, we're seeing companies that are European grown get to that point and having to look to the US or to Asia to raise their scale-up finance. And that's a concern for Europe if you're worried about European competitiveness, or you're worried about European sovereignty. And we're seeing the European institutions, as a result, we're starting to respond to that. Okay. So the European Investment Bank, with its venture finance, is working in that space, and we've been talking to them to say, look, let us help you to understand the risks of investment and providing debt financing at that scale, because actually the technology risk is maybe not as big as you think it is, and actually the businesses are not as exotic as you think they are. You know, a rocket company is a logistics company, a telecom company is a telecom company, and you know how to invest into those, so you can lend into these companies. And equally, quite recently, the European Union, through the European Commission, has launched a quite well-financed space program, and within that, there's an entrepreneurship section called Cassini. And they'll be offering risk finance on an equity basis, again, we think at that same kind of price point. So these European institutions are trying to step into that gap to fill that what otherwise exists as a gap in the private funding market in Europe.
Nick, that's extremely interesting. Again, thank you. And both you and Hélène have signaled ways that the space sector is both exemplary of broader trends in finance, the role of state actors, and also unique and pioneering. I hear in both of your comments this kind of recognition that space is both like any other domain for new investment, for the struggles over different levels of funding, for the role of state actors. And I also hear you both saying that space is unique, right? So I think that tension is a good tension. At Oxford, we tend to do research on and often teach about that interplay of technologies and markets and organizational capabilities. And I think the issues that you're raising around the legacy incumbents and the new opportunities really anchored in helping funding agencies appreciate what is familiar about space investments. Extremely timely, extremely telling. I'm also mindful of the concern you raised that a lot of those financial agencies and institutions really do still see space as an exotic area, unfamiliar and unbounded. So a great caveat in really practical terms. Thank you so much for that. I'd like to turn to Chris Blackerby, who's COO of Astroscale. Some of you know, a very prominent and very provocative Japanese founded venture. Chris, over to you again for a little bit of your perspective. You're coming to us very late in the day from Tokyo, I believe. And a chance to hear a perspective that complements and also contrasts with some of the European experience and some of the North American experience. So, Chris, over to you. 2 key developments and a worrisome trend from your perspective.
So first of all, thanks to Mark and to Oxford Space here for leading this. It's such a great panel to be on, and I'm already sorry that we only have an hour. I was looking at my clock and hearing all of the comments from Hélène and Nick, and to hear about this, it's just, there's so much to talk about. So everything that you both said, I think we have a lot of conversation to go through on this. As you said, Mark, I'm here in Tokyo, Japan. I've been out here for just give you a quick background on myself. Been out here for close to 9 years, 5 of which I was with NASA as the NASA attaché at the U.S. Embassy here in Tokyo. So focused prior to that, 10 years in DC with NASA. So focused a lot on international cooperation and building space cooperation from the government side. And for the last 3.5, nearly 4 years, I've been COO of Astroscale, which is now a global company started in Singapore and Japan, spread around the globe now to US, UK, and Israel. One point to make from the start is that this idea that sometimes gets talked about new space and old space and government funded versus venture funded. And a lot of times I think there's a talk of there being a split, but as both of the initial speakers mentioned, that is a fallacy. One cannot exist without the other. And as we proceed, new space is going to continue to need the support and funding from the traditional venture, from the traditional government-led and large industry space, and vice versa. The government-led space is going to need that innovation from the new space. So it's really important, I think, to keep focused on that. As for a couple of trends, positive and worrying on the former side, the positive, it was mentioned by Nick particularly, but also by Hélène, this idea of servicing and reusability. And that is a trend that we see. It's not going to stop. SpaceX has demonstrated it. Blue Origin's demonstrating it. So many others are focused on this. We're focused on it. We see a huge business opportunity on servicing. And that means debris removal. It means refueling. It means life extension. We've seen what Northrop Grumman has done with space logistics and servicing a satellite in GEO. We see that as really the future. It's no more a throwaway culture of we launch and we get rid of. We launch, we move, we reuse, we service, and that's just going to continue to stuff that, you know, it's the science fiction-y stuff is no longer going to be science fiction-y. Recycling in space, foundries in space, that stuff's coming. Now that's a little bit farther down the line, but we're taking the first steps up that mountain right now. And so that's a trend that we see has already been demonstrated, and we see that continuing. Going last always has the problem of the great ideas were already said, which they were.
Doing great. You're doing great.
One of the ones I wouldn't mention though is that diverse funding is something I had thought of. I was thinking as well, and that Hélène particularly mentioned this idea that there's venture, there's government, there's SPACs, there's so much going on. We are almost entirely funded by Japanese venture funding, which is rare. I mean, if you think about Japan and entrepreneurship don't tend to go hand in hand, but we've been funded almost entirely by Japanese venture. So that's been a really positive trend, this diverse funding portfolio. And then collaboration, I'd say. Everybody recognizes that this is a nascent industry, and there's still a lot to prove. And so the competition or the animosity or between companies, especially on the smaller scale, the real startups, we don't see that. We see a lot of cooperation, recognizing that we're not going to succeed without working together. Quick note on a potentially worrying trend is, I guess I'd say the capacity. What's the market going to support? When I see what's out there, and we see it's going to be big. Obviously, we wouldn't be in this business if we didn't. But there are a lot of LEO constellations. There are, we know them all: SpaceX, Starlink, Telesat, OneWeb, Amazon Kuiper, AST. I mean, they're all focused on various aspects of it, but really communications from LEO. Will the market be able to support all of those and all of this funding that goes in there? Is it going to be able to be to see a return and see some positive progress? And we're still at the front end of that. Launchers as well, seeing all of this funding going into launchers, and we see a lot of positive future, but still hasn't been proven yet. So we're waiting to see can the market support these dozens of on-demand launchers, from the big ones, the Blue Origin, the SpaceX, all the way down to the Rocket Labs and smaller, supporting smaller launch. So that's something that I'd say, as a company that's looking to service all of these, it's something that we think about a lot, making sure that can be supported.
Mm-hmm. Chris, thank you. I think, and this is really Astroscale's sweet spot, the LEO, the low Earth orbit space is itself interesting, that whole gamut, as you said, of initiatives, activities, and innovation really transforming that domain. I'm also struck, again, thank you for very thoughtful comments, done well in third place, right? But very thoughtful comments that also remind us how much of this is in process, how we're exploring, as you said, the range of servicing potentials in space, the range of businesses that are going to develop, the range of activities. And I think, like the other panelists, you've also underscored that rich set and diverse set of collaborations. You mentioned old space, new space, as colleagues may know in the audience. It's a very familiar policy frame that often unusefully distinguishes the role of state agencies and government funding from an era that's more prominently focused on commercial funding, venture capital, and space ventures. And Chris, I appreciate you really making that point, that literally the name of this series, Smart Space, is our effort, Lucas Kello, my colleagues here at Oxford, and others, to really build a new policy frame that does exactly what you're saying, Chris, that integrates and recognizes the complementary roles of both state actors and government funding, those legacy defense contractors and other large agencies that Hélène spoke to, and also the variety and diversity of this new era from SpaceX, Blue Ocean, and so forth to the very contemporary ventures. I think that's a thread. So thank you all three panelists. Exciting, provocative, interesting, important, and I appreciate that the trends you pointed to as worrisome are both mixed opportunities. They're both potentially very exciting, and as Nick said very thoughtfully, we may be missing things or missing opportunities because of the inertia from prior conceptions of both what a corporation can do and also what government actors, what state actors can do. I'd like to turn us now to a little bit more looking forward and grappling with this. The prompt question I have for each of you is, what are the kind of most pressing challenges for this innovation in the venture infrastructure? There are many challenges, and we've heard some of them already, facing the space sector all over. I'd like you to think for a second, what are the challenges you see really in facing innovation in this infrastructure space for space, and why? So again, I'm asking you here to kind of give us a little bit of your own analysis, your own thinking, what you see as the key challenges, the places we want to put young talent and expertise from our research students at Oxford, our executives, our MBAs and others. Where do we want to put talent, and why do we want to put the talent there from your perspective? So I'm going to actually start with Chris, if that's okay, and then we'll go to Nick, and then back to Hélène to make some closing remarks. And again, let me encourage our audience to be posting questions. Our team here are compiling those questions. So as you listen and hear interesting points, please welcome to put those in the chat. So Chris, back to you for that sort of forward-looking. What are the challenges that you see, the key challenges in infrastructure, venture infrastructure development, and why?
So I'll try to be as insightful as my colleagues and steal the good answers by going first.
Good idea.
I don't think I'll be able to do that, but I'll do my best.
Competition is alive and well, Chris. Competition is alive and well.
So I think the first one I would say is money. Innovation and R&D costs money, and that sounds trite. It sounds, of course it does, but Nick made the point about the financing sector in Europe and how you can get up to the 20 million or so range, but beyond that is tough. In space, you need that, especially if you're talking about doing launch or satellite development. I mean, building out a bus or a launch vehicle, it's way more than that. So to develop an innovative solution and to dive into an R&D project, it costs a lot. And so one of the things that we at Astroscale have to grapple with is creating a commercially sensitive company that is sensitive to costs and development, but also doing that for R&D. So R&D traditionally was done by huge aerospace companies and governments, and so they had that pocket budget that was focused on IRAD, internal R&D. As a startup company, that's what we're doing. I mean, we're trying to build a company based on that. So So that part, I think, is a real challenge, is making sure that we're able to get the capital necessary to build out an innovative solution that's also commercially competitive. That's a real challenge. One other one that I'd say, and the way you framed it, Mark, was good, thinking about how to look at at the workforce who's interested in this going forward. I'd say that this issues of regulation, policy globally is one that we can't ignore. And that's a real challenge as we look at innovation. And we're an international company. We have people in 5 different countries, couple hundred now around the world. We're an engineering company. Obviously, we're building out the technical solution. We have a strong policy team in London, in Tokyo, in DC. So we have got people who are focused on answering these policy questions. And as we're looking at innovating in an orbital environment that is a commons area, as it's commonly referred to, thinking about how to address not just the technical innovations, but the policy innovations that are going to make this ecosystem sustainable is really important.
Chris, thank you. That's so interesting. I'm glad you mentioned the idea of the commons. I think something of great concern to us and many others is the work of Elinor Ostrom, Nobel Prize winner, on commons governance. And that may well be what links a lot of our interest in the space sector. Is space, like some other key issues, really is a problem for the commons. How do we begin to develop meaningful rules of the game where all the actors can agree enough to be able to preserve and steward for the long-term space? And I know the work you're doing at Astroscale on debris is one of those commons problems. How do we make sure that that zone of the orbits remains viable and transportable in the face of so much debris? So appreciate that particular concern. I also appreciate you raising the question of changing expertise. For those of you in the audience, our episode 2 a few weeks ago, led by my colleague Eamon Malloy, really took up this question of sort of professional identities, the changing skill set in the space sector, what kinds of expertise are needed. What does it mean, as you said, Chris, to be an engineering company, but also interested in innovation and pioneering developments in policy? So that question of the human capital, the human infrastructure in this changing ecosystem is extremely interesting. Chris, thank you. I'm going to move over to Nick now and ask him to come in. Same issue. What are a couple of challenges you see for innovation in venture infrastructure per se, and why do you think that's important? Why do you think that?
Yeah, first I'd kind of endorse what you're saying about the commons. It's a bit Wild West out there at the moment because things are moving and evolving quite quickly, and a lot of people who don't have a background in this sector finding themselves operating in space, and the regulatory environment has not kept up with that. The standards and cooperation has not kept up with that, and the price pressures from things like insurance have not kept up with that. And so there's a lot of evolution which has to happen quite quickly in the market in order to stabilize that situation. So I totally endorse that. Another kind of challenge that we're grappling with at the moment is about kind of breaking away from this incumbency and breaking away from the legacies that we have in place without trashing the investments that are made in the past, right? So a lot of good work has been done in the past in building both kind of physical infrastructures but also institutional infrastructures, and they need to evolve quite quickly in order to stay in pace with what's happening in the privately funded market. So let me take two sides of that then. A few examples which are on my desk at the moment around commercialization of assets, expensive capital assets which have been invested in the past, but not for the purpose of being offered to commercial sale. So the lab facilities on the International Space Station, they're there. They've been bought and paid for already. But now, you can see the end of life and the end of the public financing for the space station coming up. We need to now start to bring in some commercial customers and some commercial business into those facilities. So if you're in the pharmaceutical industry or life sciences industry, or if you're manufacturing some interesting exotic material, or maybe if you're assembling something which is going to be used by someone like Chris in the space sector itself. But can we adapt that existing infrastructure for that purpose? And the same in the data infrastructure. There's a lot of Earth observation data infrastructures which have been developed for environmental monitoring, climate science, and things like this. Can they be adapted and find new commercial outlets? They weren't originally developed for that purpose, but can you take something which is pre-existing and start to commercialize it? So that's one of the challenges that we have in order to adapt the past into the future. And then I say on the institutional infrastructure, and I speak from the perspective of European Space Agency here, we have to adapt, and we have to adapt the offer that we're making to the industry because the industry is changing so quickly. Right? And Hélène referred to it at the beginning in terms of the public-private partnership models that we're developing here, where we co-invest alongside industry, we risk share alongside industry, both at the very kind of large-scale infrastructure investments, but all the way down to the startup scale. And this is where my own kind of program area operates. Is how can we just get people over the initial hump of getting a product to market and getting a company which is able to offer that product to the market, and then step back, and then institutions step back and let the private capital markets take things forward from there. These are the kind of supports that the institutional infrastructure now needs to be offering, that the space agencies have to be operating, and we have to move away from the model that we are the customer on behalf of the governments who back us. We have to stop being the customer, and we have to become the facilitator.
Again, super interesting and timely, Nick. This question of how this whole institutional apparatus takes stock, reflects, notices, these are at the heart of innovation. Those are the skill sets for innovation. And I'm struck by your saying how ESA is in the midst of doing just that. I'd be curious, and again, maybe in the question, we have time for this, who are the partners in that? What does it mean to reflect in that institutionally thoughtful way, to understand the legacy of the history and the learning and the pioneering work, and also to integrate that in this reflective way with going forward, again, as you and all the colleagues are saying, new forms of engagement, new kinds of cooperation, new initiatives that are trying out and pioneering ideas from other sectors, and also using the challenges in space to do that. So again, I hear here, and I'll just say I hear with Hélène and with Nick and with Chris, all three of you are unique in bringing multi-sector positions. You've each worked across the different pieces of the space ecosystem, and I think that gives you each a very rich view. I'd like to come back to Hélène now for a final set of comments from her. Again, she led us out today with a very high quality and challenging set of issues. Hélène, back to you now to take up this question. What are the big challenges you see in innovation infrastructure, the venture infrastructure for innovation in the sector? And again, why? Like, how are you thinking about that? What enters into your analysis? Hélène, over to you, please.
Okay, thank you, Mark. And of course, it's difficult to pass after Nick and Chris, but I'd like to mention two, basically. Number one, and this was mentioned actually already by both Chris and Nick, is the regulation stuff. I just would like to mention three very concrete areas where regulation, I think, is especially needed. Number one, of course, is the debris. This is very clear. Number two, and this was not mentioned so far, is, let's say, ground station and how we manage data. What we see now is a very clear trend with the ground station as a service, where big tech players, and it's really great they are there because they are enablers for space startups to basically put the service on. But it means that these big tech players, they're going to master not only like a very important percentage of data from the web, but also a very important percentage of the data from space. And I think it would be great to have a kind of regulation to, they're providing great services to space startups and corporates, but, the usage of these data, security, how they can manipulate or they cannot manipulate that's, I think, an area where we would need regulation. And then the third area I'd like to mention for regulation is, of course, the space exploration, where we see currently the US moving very fast, China, then allied with Russia, also moving very fast with a set of regulation which is dated from 1967, so not exactly adapted to our needs. Of course, the United States, they've published recently the new agreements of Artemis, but as we all know, Not every nation has signed that, and I think we lack or we miss an updated scheme which ideally would be signed by all the space powers. So these are the three areas where I think we need more regulation, basically. Then the second trend, because that's the first one was regulation, the second trend I'd like to mention is exploration, because this is, of course, at the heart of what I'm doing at Airbus, working on the European Service Module. And what I see here is basically a very clear race about building the first, the first step for exploration, which is logistics. And SpaceX, with Starship and the recent contract they got with NASA, they're going to build that. We're going to complement that with Orion, bringing basically humans back to the moon, etc. But the real question, of course, the question of how we're going to go there is super important and has to be solved in a very, let's say, as much as possible affordable manner and useful manner. But then comes, okay, how are we going to live there? And NASA, of course, is working on that. Same with this, Chinese Space Agency, etc. And I fully understand the race between the United States as superpower and China, Russia as space superpowers. And also, I strongly believe Europe needs to have a very important place here. But okay, that's another debate. So I fully understand that there'll be a race, between these two space superpowers, and there'll be a race for water, which is going to be the kind of the fuel for space, for life, and also for propellant. That's absolutely clear. But I also strongly believe that there are areas where cooperation would accelerate these new settlements on the moon first and then on Mars. And I don't see too much, actually. Discussions or forums can be secret or not secret, where the space powers can discuss about what are the areas where it makes sense to cooperate so that we accelerate. And there are areas where there'll be competition, like water. I strongly believe there'll be competition for water. But just take, for example, the mapping of the moon in detail. That's, for example, an area where perhaps it is worth to cooperate. So I would very much welcome, let's say, more discussions, very concrete discussions between space superpower about what are the areas where it makes sense to cooperate and what very concrete project we could fund together. And when you look back in history, let's not forget that the International Space Station was built at a time where we had Cold War on Earth. So history tells us it's feasible to do so, even at a time with very high political tensions. And I think here Europe has probably a special role to play, perhaps triggering some initiatives so that they can be very concrete talks between US and China about what are the areas where we can cooperate and what concretely we could do are very small programs to get this started.
Hélène, thank you. Again, as ever, you are signaling some incredibly core questions. Panel, thank you. Thank you very, very much. Thank you indeed for the range of your insights and expertise. We are bombarded, we're overwhelmed with questions from the audience, and those questions really reflect the kinds of themes you've raised. I'm just going to briefly summarize some of them and then invite you to selectively respond as we go ahead. There are a number of questions on how do we, given the tension between, Hélène, the value of collaboration and cooperation and the very real security challenges and differences of national interest, how do we organize innovation globally in light of the legacy, Cold War legacy, in light of the new or emerging China-US debate? So a set of questions that point to how do we do these, how do we live and deliver on the potential of collaboration and cooperation in a world that is still marked by complex economic and political and institutional struggles. So Greg has raised this question, David and Milan, a number of others, Charles has raised this concretely in the case of China. I think another set of issues, and really this comes from Madava in London, another set of issues are, this is exciting, where do we go? What's the best place for startups? What are the most promising fields? What are the most promising issues? I think a third set of issues in the questions really have to do with space debris. One of our alums, Greg Watson, says, how much of a future risk is debris, and is enough being done for effective deorbiting solutions? Others have raised some similar questions. And then there's a set of comments that really, Dimiana has raised this question. She says, quoting Nick, stop being the customer and start being the facilitator. All three of you have raised questions around how incumbent organizations and institutions in some ways have to practice in new ways. They have to reimagine what they do, what their capabilities make possible. So this shift in core roles in this dramatically changed ecosystem. So let me open up to all three of you to, I think you're all seeing the same questions that I'm seeing from the audience. Let me ask you each give a response selectively to whatever you'd like to respond to, but we've got questions of broad international organization cooperation in light of very real national interests. We've got sort of how do we do innovation in this fraught space? How are incumbent agencies reimagining what they are and what they do? And kind of concrete questions. I'm an entrepreneur. I'm somebody who cares about space. Where should I put energy? Where do I go that's interesting and promising? So please, Nick, how about if you start, and then Hélène, and then Chris.
Yeah, okay. Let me take on this question about national as opposed to international, or somehow in tension with international approaches to these things. One of the things I'm responsible for is the business incubation service of European Space Agency. So I mean, we invest into business incubators in 60 locations in 20 countries all across Europe, because the startup companies, when they start, it's a local endeavor. They can certainly work on a subnational basis. They can raise their seed finance on a subnational basis. They can get their technical support on that basis. And they don't need to be international at that stage. But then they join a market which is international. So then they want to join a network, and they want to become part of a wider market. And that market has to have some kind of stability across multiple countries, because otherwise it doesn't act as a market. So then we start talking about the market infrastructure, the standards, and the rules of engagement into the operation. And for that, you need multilateral cooperation between the private actors, which means, and ideally you want it on a multinational basis. So those two things somehow work on in cooperation with one another, depending on what stage of evolution you're at, or how much you stand back and look at an economic perspective rather than an individual company perspective. And to pick up on what Hélène was saying, there are some infrastructures where it just makes sense to only do it once, right? They're big, expensive foundational infrastructures that everybody can benefit from. One that we're working on in ESA at the moment is, okay, there's lots of people wanting to put boots on the moon right now, in search of water, for example, or in search of resources of various kinds. They're going to be driving around their vehicles. They're going to be putting their habitations down. They're going to be digging holes. There are some supporting infrastructures that are going to be needed for that. For example, in telecommunications and navigation, the same kind of satellite infrastructures that you need on Earth, you're going to need them on the moon. Because otherwise your automatic vehicle will disappear over the next hill and you'll never see it again, right? So you need that kind of infrastructure. You only want to build it once. You put a few satellites around the moon for the benefit of everybody. And that kind of thing can be a multinational cooperation still. It can be in the same spirit that we built the International Space Station. Everybody comes together and you build this once, and then we all become users of it. So that there are plenty of opportunities for internationalism, multinationalism in here, as well as opportunities for things within a national perspective. And then just finally to close on this, there's a national security layer over this, and there are particular issues of sovereignty that people have perspectives on. So there is some pressure sometimes in order to put a wall around things which are sovereign initiatives, and there seem to be strategic capabilities. So take an example in UK at the moment. UK is trying to build an independent launch capability. Right, so that it doesn't have to rely on the multinational corporations in order to get its own satellites into orbit. Some of these things are seen as being sufficiently strategic that you have to do them on a national basis, or whatever your political boundary is. Yeah.
Nick, thank you. That's helpful. That's great. Let me ask Hélène to jump in also with some of her views on these issues. Again, we've got a rich set of issues. Cooperation, debris removal, what's exciting to you? Where should I go as an entrepreneur? Hélène, over to you.
Yeah, okay. So perhaps I'll take the where should I go as an entrepreneur and then come back to the international cooperation. I'd like to make the comparison between, the way space is currently being developed or is developing and the way internet was growing in the past 20 years approximately. And we had various phases with the development of internet. We had internet 1.0 and then 2.0 and then 3.0, etc. And I think the same stuff is a bit kind of happening into space. Space kind of 1.0 with the emergence of the startups, and with a very, very important focus on basically making space affordable. I think that's really kind of space 1.0. It making space affordable with the launcher industry being completely transformed in the past 15 years. Also with the microsatellites constellation, also with the way we build satellites, like serial productions, also with the usage more and more about costs, and so everything that basically makes space affordable. So now this is kind of in the process of being done, or I wouldn't say done, but we have clearly in this phase 1.0 the big players. There are still, as I think Chris was mentioned, questions about how the market will look like, and at the end, will the market be able to sustain all of these players? I think certainly not, because that's also very common when you look at development of industries. You have a bunch of players, and at the end, just a few players who are remaining. But kind of the trend of, okay, going to space is now like much more affordable it was than before. So what's the kind of 2.0 that is coming right now? And this is the question I would ask, if I would be an entrepreneur, that's the question I would ask myself. Okay, how do I build on the shoulders of the one who have made space affordable? And here, indeed, you have all the in-orbit servicing. It's now affordable to go to orbit. So what are you going to do in orbit? Okay, you're going indeed to remove debris, but you're going to manufacture, you're going to recycle, you're going to build stuff there, etc. So that's one area. Another area is, okay, space is now affordable from Earth to orbit, but then orbit to the moon, that's still not all affordable. And we see very, very amazing infrastructures being built currently so that we can go to the moon and beyond in a more industrial manner and a much more affordable manner. So question is, okay, that's probably going to be the big players being there. Do I want to be part of that? Like we have micro launchers being part of this big launcher ecosystem. So I think there is room for agile, efficient, customizable vehicle moving here. And also once this transportation logistic infrastructure is there, what do I build on the shoulders? And I mean, Nick was mentioning we will need, constellation for positioning around the moon. Yes, for sure. We'll need also energy. We'll need capacity to drill, to have water, to transform water into, etc. And here we would need a bunch of expertise, which for most of them, I believe, do not come from the space sector. We need companies like Schlumberger exploring, the moon. We need oil and gas company, etc. So if I would be an entrepreneur, I would look at, okay, we already have the main players. What can I build, on top, based on what is already existing or what will exist? And I think what's already existing is access to orbit has been made affordable. So what is the next step that we're going to build and to do within the orbit? And then with exploration, once the infrastructure is there, what are the big markets that will emerge or the big problems that will emerge where I can bring a solution?
Yeah, Hélène, thank you. Again, each of you are bringing us such interesting and really important insights. I'm struck here, especially with what Nick was saying and Hélène, what you're saying. Some of us on the call know the work of Stu Kaufman at the Santa Fe Institute. He's a computational biologist who has really developed this idea of the adjacent possible. My colleague Teppo Felin at Oxford has worked with Stu and hosted him. And that idea of the adjacent possible, exactly what you're saying, Hélène. There's what we do today creates possibilities for tomorrow that we can't even imagine today. And I think your comments about how you want to be a space entrepreneur, yeah, debris is the place to start, but then you have to go back, as all of you have said, to circular economy, refresh, recycle, renew, build in space. I think, Hélène, your comments really underscore that adjacent possible. What we do today sets up possibilities for tomorrow. It opens up an adjacent possible that may not even be imaginable, let alone feasible today. I think it's incredibly important. Again, thank you. Many, many questions coming in. Charles raises the question, really concrete question on private ownership of resources, mined from celestial bodies. This is a commons issue. This is that focus on regulation. Nigel says, what's really exciting in terms of solving very terrestrial problems of climate change and biodiversity? This is that important link between space and space activity and the Sustainable Development Goals. I see, again, similar questions coming from Karman, several people on Astroscale and its unique location and the unique space it has carved out for itself. I'm also seeing from Faraz questions around much of this activity has been government-led or government-inspired. When will it be consumer-led? Let me come to Chris, to you as a kind of a final round of comments on this question of space debris and that whole linked set of initiatives that are so central for Astroscale. And also, Chris, I know you have views on some of these other questions as well. So Chris, over to you.
Yeah, again, we need another hour, but anyway, this has been
at
so
least,
great.
At least you've got so there you go.
And again, just to compliment the other two panelists, it's been great to be an observer of this, to hear your guys' views. It's been fantastic. And this concept of adjacent possible, I love it. I hadn't heard it before, but it's exactly what we're thinking about. We're looking at these technology capabilities of RPO, guidance, navigation, control, and rendezvous with satellite. Yeah, that's going to be great for debris removal. It has implications across the board on so many aspects of space. Obviously, from sensitive areas like security through things that Hélène was just talking about as well, on what else can be done with recycling and other aspects of space. Yeah. So, but to touch on a couple of the questions that have come up on debris, I've seen questions of, is enough being done? No, not yet. Short answer. But
question, or is that an open? No.
But I would caveat that by saying there's a lot more being done now than there was 10 years ago. There's a lot more attention in Europe and Japan, particularly where we have missions that are specifically focused on it. Hélène mentioned ClearSpace. Fantastic to see a colleague of ours taking that mission for ESA. We've got a mission with the Japan Space Agency, JAXA, to go and characterize an upper stage rocket body with them, which will eventually lead to debris removal. So there's actual missions in play. So that's fantastic. I mean, to see governments actually stepping up. And then we see the commercial sector taking the steps to prepare for this. You see OneWeb, which just launched again, and on each of those satellites that they just launched, there was a docking plate. There was a docking plate with a ferromagnetic surface that enables future servicing and removal. That's fantastic. And so that's exactly what we're testing on our mission that launched a month ago. Our demonstration mission is we're testing magnetic capture of an object in orbit. So steps are being taken. Now, who should be driving this from who should be paying? That was another question that I saw come up. We see it as a combination. The government's got to take their steps, which I just noted is happening. That's got to continue. But then the commercial sector, they should step up. I mean, there has to be. This is their area where the commercial sector is going to want to see a viable and sustainable orbital environment. There should be an incentive to make sure that stays as such. And so we see this as something where there's a responsibility from both sides to make sure that it remains sustainable. And there's a lot more to be said about this, but I know we're running out of time.
Yeah, Chris, thank you for directly answering the issues and really reminding us of the range of possible collaborators, the range of solutions. I think one of the things that's come through in the panel is these are not single organization solutions, nor are they single modal solutions. They are distributed, shared, potentially competitive, but also collaborative. Let me invite each of the panelists to just give us a very succinct phrase or two they want to close on, and then we'll wrap up for the day. Nick, maybe I'll start with you, and then Chris, and then Hélène. A phrase, basically.
Yeah, it's an interesting time for the whole system because, for the first time, it's actually starting to feel like an industry.
Super. Yep. Chris?
Together. Cooperation. This panel is a representation of government agency, startup, large aerospace. Can't do it without all three of us working together.
Thank you very much. Hélène?
Yeah, I'd like to say the team is everything. It relates to cooperation, of course, but I think working on space project, we have the immense pleasure to do things much above ourselves, just because of a great team. And that's a unique industry where one failure by one member of a team can lead to a huge catastrophe. So I'd like to express here the infinite reconnaissance to people working every day at their, each of their skills to make that happen. And I believe in the future, diversity of these teams with computer scientists, with people coming from biosciences will be a key asset to succeed.
Hélène, thank you. Thank you all three. This has been a remarkable hour, Chris, Nick, and Hélène, for your comments, your candor, and really sharing the breadth of your expertise with our audience. I want to thank everyone for joining today. It's been a very provocative and also instructive hour. I encourage people to stay involved. We have some earlier episodes, as I mentioned, with Lucas Kello and my colleague Ava Malloy. We have sessions coming up. May 21st, my colleague Maria Zubeldia will be hosting a group of experienced entrepreneurs and others to really think about entrepreneurship opportunities and jobs in the industry. We have other panels coming up later. Robert Everhart, a colleague at Stanford, who will join us to think about what's distinct about space entrepreneurship relative to other zones and activities of entrepreneurship. So again, great thanks to our sponsors. Great thanks to my personal thanks to the student team, our research students, MBAs, and others who are working with us in the Oxford Space Initiative. And finally, of course, enormous appreciation to the three panelists for both taking time and being so generous with their wisdom. Thank you all very much.